Good evening, everyone. My name is Inakshi Sopti, and I'm the CEO of the Asia Society India Center. It's great to see several familiar names in the audience, but for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, Asia Society is a leading educational organization dedicated to building awareness about art and culture, business, policy, technology, and education from across Asia on a global stage. At the India Center, our cultural programming is committed to recognizing and foregrounding the diversity of contemporary art, literature, museums and archives, and regional artistic traditions, not just from India, but from across South Asia. We have an exciting calendar of programs planned for the next few months, so keep following our website and social media handles to stay tuned. Today, I am delighted to welcome you all as we celebrate the Golden Jubilee of Mumbai's iconic Cymroza Art Gallery, started by Dr. Cymroza Godrej in October 1971 as a young artist when she was only in her 20s. The gallery chronicles a rich history as it paved the way in support of artistic endeavor in India. Over the last 5 decades, it has celebrated and shown contemporary works of art across media and forms, and has been a pioneer in supporting experimental and emerging artists. Dr. Godrej's personal journey as a collector and gallerist has been the foundation for a far richer life in the arts. As an art historian, a patron, a philanthropist, and policy maker. As someone who has firmly supported the public responsibility of private art institutions in India, her work and life serve as a useful anchor to think about broader questions around the public-facing role of private collections of South Asian art in the region and globally. To commemorate this legacy, we present our program today, Private Collections, Public Lives, which will delve into the history of private collecting in the region, how collections are represented in museums, and why it is important to think critically about collections and the public that engages with them. The webinar has been curated to complement Cymroza at 50, a constellation of 3 exhibitions across venues in Mumbai. The Cymroza Chronicles, curated by Ranjit Hoskote at Cymroza Art Gallery, and the Unpaved Earthy Crusty Road, a Nelly Setna retrospective at Chatterjee Lal, are on view till October 30th, so those of you in Mumbai, do visit if you haven't already. We have an illustrious panel navigating the discussion this evening. Levenson has since 1996 been the director of the international program at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where he coordinates the museum's relations with institutions in other countries. Prior to that, he was deputy director for program administration at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York, and has also served as guest curator for a number of exhibitions, a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, and awarded a PhD in art history by the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University. He has held positions both as a curator and museum administrator and as an attorney. Ranjit Hoskote has been acclaimed as a seminal contributor to Indian art criticism and curatorial practice, and is also a leading Indian poet. He's the author of more than 30 books and has curated multiple exhibitions in India and around the world. Most recently, he curated 2 exhibitions for the Cymroza at 50 constellation, the Cymroza Chronicles, an archival exhibition, and Mapping the Lost Spectrum, the Jamshed and Cymroza Godrej collection, a selective survey. Mortimer Chatterjee received his MA in the History of Indian Art and Architecture from SOAS and co-founded Chatterjee Lal with his wife Tara, a gallery that focuses on contemporary art and historical material. He's currently editing a major publication on modern and contemporary art from the Indian subcontinent, due to be published in 2022. And finally, our moderator, Joyoti Roy, heads strategy and marketing at the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya in Mumbai. She's interested in the social and civic role of cultural organizations and believes that arts institutions have the key responsibility to shape and reflect people's futures. She's been working in the field of museums, conservation, and culture for over 18 years. As always, we encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A tab, and for our audiences on Facebook, please drop your questions in the comment section. We will try our best to get to each question, but in case we can't, I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in. And before we move ahead, I'm so privileged to have Dr. Cymroza Godrej join us here this evening in our Zoom studio. Firoza, may I request you to say a few words before we kickstart the discussion today?
Thank you so much, Meenakshi, for that generous introduction. Good evening, everyone. As Meenakshi said, my name is Firoza Godrej, and it is such a pleasure to welcome friends and colleagues from across the world for what promises to be an insightful and relevant discussion on private collections and their relationship with the public. I want to especially thank this wonderful panel of speakers, Ranjit Hoskote, our cultural theorist, Mortimer Chatterjee, partner of Chatterjee and Lal, and Dr. J. Levenson, director of the international program at the Museum of Modern Art, affectionately called MoMA, New York, for being a part of this program, and Joyoti Roy, head of marketing and strategy at CSMVS Mumbai, for so spontaneously agreeing to be the moderator, and Asia Society India Center for hosting this program. I would also like to thank the several hands that came together to make this program a reality. Firstly, the team at Asia Society, Meenakshi Sopti, Ketaki Verma, Tarini Savara. I'd like to thank Yves Lemesli, who has been an integral part of Cymroza at 50, Ranjit Hoskote, Mortimer Chatterjee, for helping conceptualize the panel and the outreach partners for this program. To Tasneem Mehta and the Bhaudaji Lad Museum, Abhishek Poddar with Kamini Soni and the Museum of Modern Art and Photography at Bangalore, Rashmi Dhanwani from the ArtX company, Natasha Jaisingh and Alkami Nanavati from Carpe Art, and Keshav Mahendru from FAQ Art. It is always a warm feeling to see the art community come together with such unanimous support. Thank you all so much. I greatly appreciate this. I feel quite humbled, and it is indeed an honor. So thank you. And without further ado, I hand this over to Joyoti to open the discussion. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Firoza ji. Thank you. And thank you, Meenakshi, for thinking of this and bringing all of us together in conversation. I think before we start today, I'd like to just lay out a few ideas, and they will be developed further through the presentations. And if there are questions that any of you have, please keep posting them in the Q&A box all through the presentation so that we can take them up in the end. Few people know that the National Museum in Delhi has an outstanding collection of pre-Columbian art from Mexico, Peru, Argentina, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and other regions of South America, all donated by Mr. Nasli and Mrs. Alice Hiramanek in 1966. It also has an exquisite set of textiles and objects of very high craftsmanship donated by C.L. Bharani in memory of his father, R.K. Bharani, in 1976. The National Museum was established in 1949, but it was only in 2014 that it hosted an exhibition dedicated to this collection, highlighting the importance of private collections in public places. The exhibition was titled The Passionate Eye, Textiles, Paintings, and Sculptures from the Bharani Donation. The show was curated by Eka Cultural Resources and, of course, with the help of curators at the National Museum. Let us not forget that most of the objects in the National Museum's own collection were painstakingly garnered from private collections, once part of royal households, some that were gathered through diplomacy, some by force, and some by sheer tenacity of the government then. Closer home at the CSMVS, which we call today a museum for the people, by the people, and we complete 100 years in 2022, we gather that even before the formal inauguration of the museum, many individuals and institutions of the city of Bombay had come forward and gifted collections to the museum. The first object that came here was in the year 1906. It was a plaster cast Buddha head donated by Lockwood Kipling. Seth Purushottam Mauji's collection of antiquities and miniatures were purchased by the trustees in 1915. The year 1922 was marked with the bequest received from Sir Ratan Tata. These were collections that he and his elder brother, Sir Dorab Tata, had collected over many years and were housed in his residence at the York House in London. And later, when they passed on, their wives bequeathed these to the museum. They not only paid for the collection's transport, but also for their maintenance and display. And eventually, the CSMVS has received many gracious gifts and loans from Sir Akbar Haidri, Alma Latifi, Amravati Gupta, Karl Khandalawala, Firoza Godrej, and Pauline Rohatki, Ernst and Misha Yenko. CSMVS has also recently acquired a set of 350 Tanjore paintings from Kuldeep Singh, who sadly passed away in 2020. And a few years back, catering to the needs of the contemporary art lovers, the Jahangir Nicholson's collection of works of modern and contemporary arts are now housed in the CSMVS's building. And these add an extra edge to our collection and how they are experienced by the public. The point I'm making is that most of the collections that we see in our museums today were probably part of a private collection at some point in time. And when they enter public institutions, they do undergo a transformation, some favorable, but sometimes also not favorable. The time-lapse story of collecting in India has a complex trajectory, begun with royal patronage with the Mughals, extending to collections of several Indian Maharajas, souvenir making and collecting during the colonial times, to India's earliest government and private museums post-independence, and now private galleries, and more recently, digital collections. All are indicative of how individual collectors have shaped our taste, popularized artists, crafts, and created an image for India here and for the world. Some gleaming examples include the Suresh Neotia collection, the Podar collection, Kiran Nadar's collection, the Tapi collection of textiles, the Alkazi collection of photography, the Jagdish Mittal collection of miniature paintings, the Mehrangarh Museum and Jodhpur Royal collections, the Baroda collection, the Nizam collection, Dr. Karan Singh's collection at the Amar Mahal Museum and Library, and of course, the collections of Dr. Firoza and Jamshid Godrej, which she has so graciously made available for the public through various channels. In today's panel and presentations, we will have a chance to see illustrations of how private collections take on a public aura, sometimes when they end up in museums, but also often when they become part of private appreciation. Many stalwart institutions that have nothing to do with the arts had a culture of collecting in India, and today they are one of the best patrons of modern India and her creative output. But what do these trends tell us about the relationship of an individual and a work of art? And what happens to that relationship when these collections join the ocean called a public institution? These are some of the ideas that our panelists will reflect upon. We begin with Mortimer Chatterjee. It's funny because his name has often rung in my head with Mortimer Wheeler, the Director General of the ASI during partition, who was bestowed with the difficult, complex, and painful responsibility to split the collections between Delhi and Karachi. But our Mortimer, of course, has brought much together through his beautiful, progressive gallery, Chatterjee Lal, and his scholarship has a whiff of uniting, at least on the plane of research, some of the most iconic institutions and collections of modern India outside the parlance of museums. Over to you, Mortimer. And of course, there will be opportunity for questions, but let's hear all three panelists first. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Joyoti, for that wonderfully generous introduction. And this Mortimer is indeed named after that Mortimer. So there we have a direct connect to the original. Let me just get the... So I think... can you see my screen, Joyoti? Is that, yeah? I think I'd love to flesh out some of the preliminary ideas that you've, and some of the collections indeed that you touched upon in your introduction. And I'm of course going to be talking really with respect to modern and contemporary art. And first off, really thinking about the relative absence of major collections of modern and contemporary art amongst public museums in India. that has really had the effect of muting their collective voice, as well as hindering the ability to provide Indian audiences with access to important artworks. And it's precisely that makes this work by Atul Dodia and the satirical intent so potent. This, of course, is his 7,000 Museums 2014, which was shown to great acclaim at the Dr. Balaji Lal Museum in Bombay. And the informed viewer understands, of course, the sheer unlikeliness and hence humor of finding a swanky public museum with a first-rate collection of modern and contemporary art located in any Indian city, large or small today. In India, it has been really private collections instead who have been pioneers in the patronage of modern and contemporary art, especially since around the 1960s. And it is also private collections that have led the way in providing access to art made during the 20th and 21st centuries. As a result, today they are largely responsible for building and expanding the canon. And I think this is something that Ranjit will expand on later. To set the scene for today's conversation, I thought to try and make sense of what has been achieved in terms of engagement with the Indian public at large since the late 19th century. And my presentation looks at those various facets and features that have allowed modern and contemporary art collections to reach significant audiences, however inadequately. The nature of these collections vary over time. In the early period, it's mainly state-backed, whilst in the later period, we come to looking at private initiatives. You must forgive my generalizations and the large absences that are inevitable in a 10 to 15 minute presentation of such a large topic. So the first facet that I'd like to look at in terms of publicizing art of the time is the exhibition space. And at the turn of the 20th century, one of the most prolific and public collectors and patrons was, of course, the Maharaja of Baroda, Shivaji Rao Gaikwad III, 1863 to 1939, regularly loaning to major art and design exhibitions hosted both in India and abroad. The provenance of Baroda became an internationally recognized stamp of quality. The famous late 19th century artist Raja Ravi Varma was commissioned to make a host of pictures by the Maharaja, and by all accounts was very much taken by Baroda's vision for a museum and art gallery. In 1895, indeed, the artist, who was a native of Kerala, wrote to the Divan of Travancore to, quote, beg permissions to submit to you for the consideration of government a scheme for the establishment of an art gallery in Trivandrum. In order to sell the idea to the Divan, Varma drew on the reputation of the Maharaja of Baroda. He said, I wish to cite Baroda, His Highness the Gaikwad, who possesses a collection of paintings and statuary that is the admiration of every visitor to the state. Here, the art gallery is understood as a fundamentally critical component in providing access to art. And in Baroda's case, the museum and picture gallery were actually thrown open to the public in 1921. Government-backed commissions were relatively infrequent during the colonial period. Many of the largest occurred in the late 1920s for the newly inaugurated Secretariat buildings in Delhi, part of the government complex executed by architects Lutyens and Baker. Under the stewardship of Gladstone Solomon, principal of the JJ School of Art in Bombay at that time, a number of students, as well as school alumni, including Samuel Faizi Rahameen and Rustam Siodia, and this is a slide showing one of Siodia's preparatory studies for the Secretariat murals, were commissioned, as I said, in 1928. Sadly, reception to the works was mixed, and apart from a commission for the Dome of India House in London in the early 1930s, there really weren't any major commissions by the colonial government thereafter. So if we've looked first at the exhibition space. Here we're looking at the public building. I'd now like to turn to the idea of the public museum. The National Gallery of Modern Art in Delhi was formed as the repository of modern contemporary art and opened in 1954. Sadly, with paltry holdings of just 200 paintings, of which no less than 96 were by Amrita Sher Gill. And those were gifted to the museum by the artist's late husband, Victor Egan, and here is a portrait of Egan by Shergill. In later years, there were some bulk purchases, for instance, works by Nandalal Bose and Ramkinkar Bej, but there was never any dedicated acquisitions program in place, and maybe that's something that we'll touch upon in our discussion later. Instead, we need to really look to other types of institutional building in the period. And indeed, in the same year as the NGMA was opened, the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Bombay started collecting under its first director, Homi Bhabha, who was a confidant of Nehru. And there we can see in the slide, Nehru and Bhabha together looking at the plans of the maquette for the TIFR, and from whom Bhabha secured a generous yearly budget to spend on the acquisition of art, leveraging a group of influential advisors, including the art critic Rudi von Leyden, who you can see in this painting, which is part of the TIFR collection and executed by Walter Langhammer, another European emigre, as well as people like M.F. Hussain. The Institute was able to amass a group of more than 100 paintings and sculptures even before the Institute's opening in 1962. And indeed, the Institute went on to collect more than a dozen paintings a year, at least until 1968. By the time it stopped collecting, around 1975, the TIFR really represents probably one of the greatest collections that we have, over 250 art objects, many of which were hung in a dedicated gallery space and which were frequently illustrated in art journals of the period. And really here we have a sense of an art scene being willed into being by a collector and his advisors. Highlights from the collection include a magnificent group of works by V.S. Gaitonde, which you can see down there on the bottom right of this slide, which traces the artist's career right from the 1950s to the late 1970s, as well as holdings by Jahangir Sabharwala, bottom left of this slide, and sculptures by Adi Daviwala, which you'll see at the top row of this of the slide. I'd now like to turn to the idea of art in an ambassadorial role. By the early 1960s, Air India and TIFR were actively vying with each other for the best works coming onto the market. In keeping with its mission to promote India's culture in the broadest sense, Air India's modern and contemporary collection was one of amongst several areas of focus that included classical sculpture, textiles, and miniatures. Air India installed artworks in its booking offices worldwide, and illustrations from the works in its holdings were included in the design of objects, such as airline onboard menu cards. And here we see an onboard folder with designs from works originated by M.F. Hussain. This dates from around 1963. And rarely, of course, in art talks do you actually get the chance to be of the moment, but we do this evening, because it may be worth pausing to reflect on the fact that as of this afternoon, the airline is set to return to private hands as it has now been acquired by the Tata Group. This now makes the Tata custodians of indisputably the largest art collection in private hands in the country, since it already includes collections of Tata Steel and the Taj Hotel Group. And so thinking about the private sphere now, in particular, I'm interested in the idea of art which functions in an interdisciplinary and scholarly space, and also the oncoming of the commercial gallery scene. And I take here the Alkazis as my leitmotif for this. Owning a gallery, of course, presents a prime opportunity for collecting, and legendary theatre director Ibrahim Alkazi and his wife Roshan became engaged with the burgeoning art scene in Bombay during the late 1940s, at the time when they were both establishing the theatre unit at the Vallabhbhai Desai Memorial Institute, which was a multi-art space with artist studios. They occupied neighboring spaces with artists such as Gaitonde, Padamsi, Mehta, Hussain, and here in the slide you see Hussain's masks, which were designed for one of Alkazi's productions. In the early 1960s, when a number of artists were relocating to the nation's capital, the Alkazis also moved to Delhi. And in 1977, the couple opened Art Heritage, the much storied gallery, which was to be complemented by a photography gallery come archive, which was called Sepia International in New York. Alkazi was the confidant of many artists working in India and was keen to internationalize the art scene. In the 1990s, his televised 6-part series, Indian Art and Modernism, for the state broadcaster, was a key resource for art history students. And here in the slide, you can see Alkazi and Souza during the shoot for one of those episodes. Thinking more about the internationalization of modern and contemporary art at that time, we now turn to the great diasporic collections. From the 1960s, perhaps the most prolific private collectors of Indian art were the American couple Chester and Davida Hurwitz, and here they are. At Chester's death in 1999, the collection numbered some 3,000 objects, of which 850 or so were subsequently bequeathed to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. With works on permanent display at the PEM and a scholarly publication that focuses on the collection, the Hurwitz holdings function as one of the most important nodes in the public-facing network of Indian art collections in North America. My next facet of publicizing collections is to look at the era of private foundations. In a recent phenomenon, opportunities have arisen to see modern and contemporary art in India in settings other than commercial spaces or state-run museums. This has been made possible through a clutch of collections that have opened spaces in India in the form of foundations and private museums. They include the Kiranada Museum of Art, the Davy Art Foundation, the Jahangir Nicholson Art Foundation, Piramal Art Foundation, Kasturbai Lalbai Museum, and the Museum of Art and Photography MAP. The KNMA is the country's first private museum for modern and contemporary Indian art and was opened in New Delhi in 2010. Kiran Nada is the preeminent collector of her generation. Her chosen areas span the full spectrum of art practices, and she has made an indelible mark on the art scene since she started collecting in the late 1990s. It is no exaggeration to say that the importance of the collection and the exhibitions hosted at the museum since its inception have influenced the direction and tendencies discernible in the Indian arts ecosystem. A View to Infinity, curated by the museum's director and chief curator, Rubina Karode, of a retrospective of Nasreen Mohammadi, was a landmark exhibition in 2013. The museum also regularly lends to international exhibitions and was a key collaborator in India's pavilion during the 58th edition of the Venice Biennale in 2019. I'm so sorry. Finally, is the last facet I'd like to look at. It's the digitization of collections in the online space. Collections that emphasize systematic acquisitions where works have a serial relationship to each other often privilege the educational aspect of their holdings. The increasing ease with which artworks can be digitized and presented online has allowed collection archives to present ever more sophisticated user experiences. One such example is the Museum of Art and Photography, MAP, based in Bangalore. It's a collection which at its heart is driven by the holdings and collection strategy of Abhishek Poddar, but it has also become a collection of collections in a sense. Having begun to collect during his teenage years and from the outset possessing an eclectic range of tastes, Poddar's dream of opening a private museum was put into motion in 2016. Its online presence as a digital museum is something of a first in the Indian context, with particular attention paid to the quality of its online exhibitions. And we have, in a slightly futuristic mode here, a digital avatar of MF Hussain, who visitors can speak to. So in conclusion, the proliferation of private Indian art collections looking to engage with audiences and the increasing sophistication with which this can be achieved through digital resources promises positive disruption to the functioning of the arts ecosystem. Ravi Varma's plea to the Divan of Travancore at the turn of the 20th century was straightforward. Collect and then show what you have collected. That is what artists want, and it will inevitably encourage the growth of engaged audiences. So with that, I would like to now really turn to the story of international museums becoming active in the research, exhibition, and acquisition of artwork by artists from India. And I think Jay will be addressing us on that. I'll stop share and hand over to, is it Jyoti or to Jay?
Either way is fine, but thank you so much, Mortimer. I think you've been able to quite successfully spotlight some of these major trends more in modern India and how things have developed. As you rightly said, our next speaker is Jay Levenson. He's been introduced, but I'd just like to say that his role at MoMA is already quite well known. But today, he speaks more about how his museum has been collecting things, art objects from South Asia, and how perhaps some of these early acquisitions now fit in with the purpose of the museum and what's happening in the country. I invite Jay Levenson to make his presentation, and for audiences who've had thoughts about Mortimer's presentation, please hold them or just post them in the Q&A box so that we can take them up later. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. My talk is a little bit different. It's about the MoMA collection of South Asian art, but I wanted to start just with, there we go, with the beginnings of the museum, because it was founded by 3 private collectors, led by Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, Nelson's and its mother, but with 2 of her friends, Mary Sullivan and Lily Bliss. And they started the museum, and it's remained essentially a privately funded institution ever since. Of the 3, Lily Bliss had the most important collection. And when she died a few years later, she left it to the museum. So it became the origin of the museum's collection. There are still very significant paintings like this Modigliani that are still in the collection. Other of her works were sold, along the years to fund other acquisitions. But the museum, of course, started as a private institution. And then, of course, the first director, Alfred Barr, was very much a collection builder. And he worked out his theory of collecting in the early years of the museum, which he memorialized in this famous diagram of a torpedo. He felt the Museum of Modern Art should be a collection of the past 50 years, sort of moving forward in time. And that as the works became too old for a modern museum, they should either return to the market or migrate to the Metropolitan Museum, which some actually did. His philosophy ultimately changed, and now we just collect from the 1880s going forward. But you can see in his original diagram, that arrow is the origin of the museum's collection. He was thinking mostly of Europe. Even America, figured in the minority, and the only non-European, non-North American collection he envisioned was the Mexicans, as you can see there. But of course, his ideas over time broadened. And in fact, although the original torpedo didn't include the rest of the world, including South Asia, he was open to acquisitions from other areas. And in the 60s, with funds from private donors, he acquired works from South Asian artists who were in New York, Gaitonde, Mohan Samant, Satish Gujral. Those pictures were exhibited in 1964 in a recent Acquisitions from South Asia exhibition. For some reason, the museum included Turkey, Iran, and Israel in South Asia. I think that confusion has been settled now. But of course, the works went back into storage, and so far the Gaitonde is the one that has reemerged, but I'm confident that the others will as well. It should be said that he was also interested in Latin America. He initiated several campaigns, Barr initiated several campaigns of acquisitions from Latin America, and ultimately in Africa as well. but there was no sort of concerted effort to collect from various parts of the world. There was really an emphasis on North America and Western Europe during these years. And also the traveling exhibition program, which was managed by my department, the international program, was more interested on the whole in showing off American art outside the United States than in bringing things to New York. So there were various exhibitions sent to India, a design exhibition that traveled to various cities, and then this 2 decades of American painting, which circulated in 1967. You could see on the right the cases being loaded into open trucks, which we don't do anymore. And we even sent Clement Greenberg to convince Indian artists that they should stick to abstraction and avoid, figural work, which was the philosophy of the museum. And, obviously the reason that those acquisitions of Indian paintings in the 60s were abstract works. So gradually things did expand, but rather slowly. These Tsarina drawings were purchased in the 1970s with private funds, but selected by the curators. Things became more animated in the 2000s. There's a Nazreen Mohammadi drawing on the lower left, acquired in 2006, and a major installation by Nalini Malani, which came into the collection in 2007. But still, there wasn't a systematic program of acquiring works from around the world until the establishment of our CMAP Global Research Program, which is managed by my department, but which was the brainchild of my colleague, former colleague, Kathy Hallbreich. She helped us set up 3 areas of collecting: Asia, Latin America, and Central and Eastern Europe, selected because they were outside the original focus of the museum's collection. We later added Africa, and Latin America now has its own independent research institute. So the way we've managed this program is we have workshops. She was actually able to assign groups of about 15 staff, mostly curators, to these different research groups. And we put a senior curator in charge of each one. And we were ultimately able to add graduate and postgraduate fellows to the groups. So these groups had workshops in New York with scholars and artists and curators from various parts of the world who came to New York to conduct the seminars. There was a yearly trip by each group to the place that it was studying. And there was no specific results expected from any of the groups. The idea was that if they were successful, exhibitions and acquisitions would quite naturally come from the research, but not to require the groups to produce anything, basically. And the other idea was, rather than have a specific curator in charge of a particular geographical area, we'd be essentially educating curators and other staff members in all the departments about these different places so that the knowledge would expand throughout the museum. So the Asian group actually began with a focus on Japan. Did more work on East Asia, but then when Stuart Comer arrived at the museum and became the group leader, he'd done work when he was at the Tate in South Asia and wanted to move the group's focus, and the members of the group agreed. We're quite democratic here, and he was helped by Sean Anderson in our architecture department and Ratan Joel as the fellow. So in all, the group worked on South Asia from roughly 2015 to 2020, when it switched to Southeast Asia. There were 37 meetings, I counted them, that took place in New York with various authorities who came to MoMA. I'm just showing you 2 here, Zarina on the right, Kuzia Rahim on the left, talking about the Lahore Biennale. Here's Geeta Kapoor speaking to the group in 2017 at MoMA. And also the group made 4 visits to the region. I'm just showing you some of the places they went to. Studio visit with Vivan Sundaram and another with Jyotish Rina Kalat. They traveled to various cities. I counted Delhi, Mumbai, Goa, Kochi, Bangalore, Baroda, Calcutta, and Pondicherry. Excuse me. And the results have in fact developed. I counted from our lists of works in the collection, 128 works that are traceable to CMAP research. And they include, more recently major works like the sculpture by Mrinalini Mukherjee, Dayanita Singh's Museum of Chants. And while the group itself has moved on to Southeast Asia, the acquisition efforts are ongoing, and the new installations are no longer divided either by medium or by nationality. So you can see this is a photograph of the current installation. Gaitonde has taken a place next to Rothko. Those 2 icons are just from our website. The gallery doesn't have those green circles. And we're also working on and also I wanted to show our website. This is CNAP's website, and it's highlighted various acquisitions like this installation of Sheila Gowda's that recently entered the collection. And we've also actually started a new research effort, a documentary anthology of writings on art in South Asia. It'll probably include writings roughly from the 1920s to the 1980s. And we were very fortunate to be able to start the project with a meeting in Colombo just before the pandemic in January of 2020. So that work is well underway. So what I'd say in brief is that this new emphasis on research that started with the CMAP program has made a huge amount of difference within the museum in terms of collection building. And particularly because the knowledge has gone to all of our curatorial departments. We have painting and sculpture in one, photography, architecture and design, drawings and prints, media and performance. The acquisitions have taken place in all of these different departments. So although our collection in South Asian art still isn't a balanced one, I'd say there is every reason to believe that over the coming years, it will become a more integral part of our overall collection. So thank you. And I will pass the screen share back to you.
Thank you so much, Jay. That's quite riveting to see so many works in your collection, and more particularly the process that you now adopt to acquire. I think it's very balanced. It's quite informed, and there's something to learn from that. We do have 2 questions in our Q&A box, and I just want to remind our viewers that we will come back to them after our last presentation. I now invite Ranjit Hoskote, a name very well known in Mumbai, to speak on how private collections can be re-energized when placed in a museum context, with reference to Abbey Gray and Indian modernism, selections from the New York University Art Collection, and Mapping the Lost Spectrum, the Jamshid and Cymroza Godrej collection. He will be talking about these 2 case studies and illustrating what he means by re-energizing some of the private collections in museums. He's also currently curating a show of paintings of Sousa at the Jahangir Nicholson Art Foundation Gallery at the CSMVS, which will shortly open for the public. Over to you, Ranjit.
Thank you so much, Joyoti. And thank you so much, Mort and Jay, for your marvelous presentations. What I have to say will touch on various things you've talked about. I'm going to try and share my screen. Alrighty. Is that visible to everybody? Okay, great. So what I really want to talk about is 2 collections that I've had the privilege of working with. The first is the Abbey Weed Gray collection, which is the nucleus of the Gray Art Gallery at New York University. And the other, of course, is the Jamshid and Cymroza Godrej collection. That exhibition is ongoing. And what I want to do is to think about these two private collections. Interestingly, both really inspired and kept going and reflective of the vision of women collectors in each case. And in each case, taking a certain kind of view of artistic production in South Asia. And I'll unpack what that meant in each case. The roadmap is brief. I'll begin with the Abbey Wheatgrey collection, and especially this exhibition that Susan Hapgood and I co-curated in 2016, drawing on it. Then there's a sort of an intermezzo where I think a little bit about some processes of canon formation in Indian art that got underway in the 1990s through a set of influential publications and exhibitions, the outcomes that scholarly infrastructure had on the market at large, and then I'll conclude with a few reflections on Firoza's collection. So the two collections will bookend this presentation. It's a 12-minute run, right? Joyoti, kind of signal to me when I hit 10. So I want to start really with, and also I'm going to try and contextualize these collections in their historical moments and think also of the affective drives that bring people to the practice of collection in the first place. So I'm going to characterize Abbey Wheatgrey's collection as having been driven by a wide-ranging curiosity, and have also had the occasion to think about her collection as what I've called a pre-canonical space, for reasons that I'll make explicit now. Because when I began to work on it with Susan, it came to me that there were many artists there who had really more or less either fallen off the map or had been pushed to the periphery of a broad public understanding of modern Indian art. And I wondered why that was and why they had been so salient to an American collector. Abbey Grey, as many of you know, had her roots in the Midwest, then a strong connection with New York. And that's the catalog. And she seemed to have two great sources of authority in her life, which gave her her passion for the world and for its artistic production. The first was God, and the second was the State Department. She was an Episcopalian, and this led her to believe in what she often has described in her letters and her diaries as a belief in one world. So in one sense, liberal universalizing understanding of what constituted the modern. And she traveled extensively. And the itinerary of her travel is quite interesting. It maps very much on the kind of time that Jay was talking about in terms of the early acquisitions of MoMA. It was Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, and India for the most part. And it's not coincidental that this is the great age of area studies. It's where the State Department and the university apparatus are investing heavily in understanding these other cultures, and they play a great role in the American worldview. This is when CENTO, the Baghdad Pact, is very salient. When CETO, the Manila Pact, those countries, that formation is very salient. So it's interesting that the itinerary is Istanbul, Ankara, Tehran, Karachi, Lahore, Delhi, Bombay. And we, of course, India being non-aligned, got more or less the best of both worlds and was being courted by both sides. And it's in that, meaning the Soviets and the US. So this is the broader historical frame in which you have someone like Abbey Grey coming in to India, collecting, meeting with gallerists, for instance, such as Keku Gandhi in Bombay, and going, for instance, in Delhi, also through the gallery system across to artists who are working more privately. And some of the people that she engaged with were, even if they were salient, they have for a long time not been necessarily central to our understanding of the modern. And I'd like to flag Satish Gujral here. And this might seem like a strange comment, but to me, it's always seemed that the cultural geography of a certain phase of the Indian modern has to do with the connection of the first generation of post-colonial Indian artists to Paris, to London, to New York, largely. Gujral, as many of us here know, very early on went to Mexico City, allied himself with a very different wager on the modern from what we would today call the global South, apprenticed himself to the Mexican muralists, and then came back with all of these ideas, these more revolutionary ways of understanding a post-war world, and how that played out in the era of the anti-colonial struggles. Also, an artist who attracted the attention of Mrs. Gray was Prabhakar Barve, who, again, although looked upon with great respect, is not necessarily a key canonical figure, not one that has even been really annotated and contextualized properly, despite occasional exhibitions. From the exchanges with the artist, from Mrs. Gray's interest in his work, it's clear that she also had space in her understanding for an artist who came to the modern through a more occult, if you will, route. Someone who was not in a token way, but quite strongly and substantially committed to notions of yoga and tantra. This is one of his works which is in the collection. I have Devyani Krishna here also because our viewers from Delhi, of course, do not need to be reminded of this, but Devyani and Kamal Krishna played a key role. And yet, apart from, I think, an exhibition that Ram Rahman was instrumental in organizing perhaps 2 decades ago, it's not as if Devyani Krishna has received her due in some sense. And again, I was delighted to see that she does have a place. There are several works by her in this collection. So how does one seek a vantage point in a collection housed in New York, in a university museum? And how does that help us to navigate a way through the actually existing artistic positions that prevailed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? And why is it that those are not reflected better, whether in the market at large or in the expositions that museums commit themselves to? So I found it very, very salutary to see the Abbey Wheat Gray collection as a set of reserve possibilities, something to go back to, alternative and eclipsed and lost histories to be retrieved for the present time. And I found myself thinking that this is a source of inspiration. This is something we can engage with critically and think about the roads not taken in terms of collection practice, which in turn really inform the sense of future generations as to what were the questions and the issues at stake. Santosh, again, someone who has been, Ghulam Rasool Santosh, who's been identified with a particular kind of movement, loosely described as Neo-Tantra, which has also become a way of putting him in a certain sort of box. Whereas looking at his work in this collection, I found myself thinking of the kinds of struggles, the kinds of dialogues between his own position, a certain engagement with Sufism and Kashmir Shaivism. What were the kinds of dialogues he was crafting with the larger languages of international modernism? And how might one retrieve him for an expanded sense of the modern, of our own Indian modern? And where might one situate him on that kind of expanded map? Mohan Samant again, who is now, after decades, back in the limelight. But for years, for decades, he'd been eclipsed. And this was a very particular kind of eclipse because he made his life in New York. Often said that the only 25 times that he left his house to go out, and each time he would just go to the Met and immerse himself in the works of previous civilizations. And yet, as you see, when Paula Cooper was showing him in the 60s, he was, Mrs. Gray acquired his work, as did MoMA. So it's that same period that we're looking at. I should also say, by the way, that the Gray collection, the Gray Art Gallery, has had connections with several of the institutions who are in play this evening. There was a major exhibition of Iranian modernism in 1976. A number of sculptures by Parviz Tanavoli came from the Gray collection to MoMA's exhibit. And in 1996, of course, the Asia Society's Traditions and Tensions had the Gray as one of the partner institutions and venues. So just to spell out again the transcultural circulations through which work from that god-awful term, the non-West, has circulated in the metropolitan centers. But also to think about how somebody like Mohan Samant, who elsewhere I've characterized as a one-man avant-garde, was appreciatively received at a certain point in the 60s, but then slipped off the charts both at home, both in Bombay and in New York. And so there's also room to see how private collections can allow us to retrieve the works of eccentric, if you will, and I mean this word in the best sense, eccentric artists who do not fall in with other kinds of groups and formations. Despite his token membership of the Progressive Artists group, Samant was really very much his own person, very idiosyncratic, and also ahead of his colleagues among the progressives in terms of his formal and technical experiments. Briefly now, I just want to dwell on books and shows that we are all familiar with, but I had occasion whilst working on the Gray exhibit to think about how these have formed the scholarly infrastructure in the 90s that would then support what happened in the early 21st century in terms of artistic positions that were regarded as canonical and worthy of collection. These two marvelous. Remember that I'm not being critical of these books and exhibitions per se. These were marvelous and important advances in the field, but it just happened that they sustained certain kinds of outcomes that I'm not, as it happens, so happy with. Tapati Guha Thakurta's and Partha Mitter's marvelous books on the Bengal school and the background to certain nationalism in art and what formed the prelude to developments in Shantiniketan. Yashodhara Dalmia's exhibition at the NGMA, the inaugural exhibition at the NGMA Bombay, and the book that emerged from research into the Progressive Artists group and its umbilical connection with the city of Bombay, and how they developed themselves as a phalanx of an avant-garde phalanx in the late 40s and through the 50s. Shivakumar's marvelous Shantiniketan, The Making of a Contextual Modernism, which I think for many people, certainly in Western India, really emphasized the role of Shantiniketan in having established this indigenously achieved modernism and its various transcultural connections. I remember certainly as someone in my 20s, I remember how inspired and excited I was to see the exhibition and to read the catalog. Ghulam Sheikh's landmark book on Baroda, which really brought together and summarized all of the work done under the sign of the Baroda group or the Baroda school, and the various contributors to this volume really helped historicize all of that work, which until then I think had been part of a certain circulating folklore and oral history. This book really canonized it in a certain specific way, and it went into pedagogy and into museum understanding, and also, I suspect, informed the collectorial imagination. I have this book as a counterexample. Everything that all the books and the publications and exhibitions that I showed before have had an influential effect. Now, for whatever reason, Joseph James's The Madras Metaphor, despite its very encouraging and generous forward by Ibrahim Al-Qazi, fell out of sight. It was a book that championed the artists of Cholamandal. And now, whatever you might think of that historical moment and the particular kind of nostalgic, if you will, vision of the artists of Cholamandal and their expression of a standpoint that did not map easily onto the roots to the modern taken by their contemporaries in Bombay or Delhi or Baroda. This book is really, it's not in print anymore. It's rarely remembered. And it seems to have somehow missed this moment. It also was published in this same, what I see as a seminal moment of publication. So that's my counterexample, how it's not only not had any influence, but it actually has fallen off the map entirely. I'll race through this second intermezzo, which is the canon as an avenue of influence. We're all familiar with this, it seems to me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's looked at auction catalog after auction catalog. And not that I'm not a fan of these artists. I think that they were all each courageous visionaries and really opened up new routes to the modern, and we keep returning to their work in what we do. But it appears that they dominate the scene to possibly the disadvantage of some of the artists that I mentioned earlier when I talked about the Gray collection. Hussain, Souza. The irony is not lost on me, Joyoti, that I'm about to be doing a Souza show. Tayyab, Mehta, Ram Kumar, Bhupen Thakkar. And I'll come to the end of what I have to say, thinking about the Jamshid and Cymroza Godrej collection, which despite its name, I have to say, is an intergenerational collection. It also, both within the collection and in the selective survey that I curated out of it, it also represents the collecting practice of Navroz Godrej in the next generation. So to me, this collection, if the Gray collection is a pre-canonical space to me, I find myself thinking of the Godrej collection as a para-canonical space, a collection that has been developed in full awareness of an emerging canon and yet makes choices that go against the grain, driven by what I see as an eclectic curiosity in terms of genre, medium, the selection of artists, the location of artists. Now, this was something that Mort described as my manifesto wall when he walked into the space and saw us installing it. I called the show Mapping the Lost Spectrum because it seems to me that just as Mrs. Gray was inspired by God in the State Department, it seems to me that Cymroza Godrej has certainly been inspired by a vision of cultural production that goes back to thinkers and cultural path-breaking cultural figures like Kamala Devi Chhatrapati, who were open to a variety of starting points for what they saw as a force of creativity, despite the social location, the milieu, the artistic lineage, or the medium. So on this wall, we had Raza Subramanian, K.G. Subramanian, S.H. Raza, Manjit Bawa, Badri Narayan, but also artists from Mithila like Bindeshwar Paswan, also anonymous work late by Kalighat artists in a late phase. Also to make the point that here in this collection, we have the possibility of enlarging our sense of what constitutes the modern past, such long-playing but perhaps not very helpful debates such as those over the arts and the crafts, and the still prevalent apartheid in museum practice and in research practice. I think to hold these as separate domains. There's good reason for thinking of them as parts of separate histories, but I think there are also compelling arguments to bring them together into the same space and then reflect on conditions, circumstances, and choices in which, in fact, all of these artists have had to live and work, and how different sorts of economies and ecologies are at play behind the image. Now we need to acknowledge these differences rather than to simply have these works occupy different kinds of museum institutional locations. It was also a good occasion to think about artists who have either become identified with their anthropological or research work or their activist roles, such as Hapu Shah, or have really fallen off the map in some way, like Shavak Javda, who was a major Bombay painter. Remember that in the old days, before the progressives alone were seen to be the Bombay artists, critics, for instance, like Badri Narayan, like Richard Bartholomew, tend more often to speak of an expanded Bombay school, or the Bombay artists, really. So this exhibition was also a way of bringing back certain artistic positions to mind and of showing them to a new audience, getting a new audience interested in artists with whose works they might not otherwise have had an opportunity to engage. Also, in thinking through the latitude, the amplitude of objects and collected and practices responded to. There's Benita Purcell, whose sculptures also have an olfactory dimension and seem to have practically everything that the Magi took with them to Bethlehem, or not quite. You'll see all of the different things that have gone into this work. So it was also a way of thinking about the collection itself. Not only are the collectors representative of intergenerational sensibilities, but the collection itself represents different kinds of generations and artistic choices at play. it was also the occasion to revisit phases of the work of certain artists with which people may not generally have been familiar. So this was a part of the exhibition, which had Meera Mukherjee, but also artists from the Zal Praxis portfolios, an important initiative that the Cymroza Art Gallery was part of in the early 1990s for Indian printmakers. So that's Dakoji Devraj, R.M. Palaniappan, and Jean Bhaunagri. This is an early Nasreen painting, quite distinct from the kind of work one is familiar with and associates Nasreen with. And this is the work of Pilu Poch Khanawala. In some cases, it also came to me when I was thinking about the Gray collection that some of these artists, such as Adi Davirwala here or Pilu Poch Khanawala, also disappeared from the scene well before the canon building or the canon forming processes of the 1990s. So their work was really, it had vanished into private collections. It was not widely seen or available or documented. And so for me, both of these exhibitions are also projects of retrieval and rendering homage to artistic positions that have been unjustly forgotten. And here is an early Rekha Rodlatia painting, also very distinct and quite different from the kind of work that most, or at least younger viewers, know her for. So there's also a way in which an exhibition like this can help trace different biographical journeys of the artists that we think we know, and yet we revisit surprises, and those surprises become starting points for new ways of thinking and writing about and viewing these artists. Also, I really wanted to bear witness to the Godrej Collection's ability to embrace such a diverse set of art making practices and to deal with each in a certain amount of detail. So the ceramics aspect of the collection also engages with the various lineages of ceramics in India, whether it's Ray Meeker in Pondicherry or Gurcharan Singh in the hills, or Nirmala Patwardhan, who was both a practitioner and someone who wrote a technical handbook on the subject. Veronique Jasawala, who didn't really pursue a career in the arts, but was very much on the scene in the 70s and 80s. So once again, a figure lost to time, coming back through the medium of the exhibition, as well as also that part of Firoza's collection and the work of the Cymroza Art Gallery that reaches internationally. So you have the Triskelion studios from Crete who are represented. So there are also signs and traces in this collection that point to the transnational and transcultural reach of a collection. And this is my last slide, where again, it's a way of thinking through how the photography part of the collection helps us to trace several generations of photographers. This is Sunil Jana. We also had Ketki Sheth elsewhere. There's Balan Nambiar's sculpture. To me, this was also a way of thinking about how you can read an exhibition as an extended reflection also on certain kinds of histories of the nation. A history of industry, a connection between the great fascination with industrial infrastructure, which formed such a part of the national imagination through the 50s and 60s, and how that's resonated for artists, and how that then comes to rest in a collection, and how might it be reactivated. Now, this to me, I end here. One of the reasons for going into this exhibition was also to think of how it might serve as some kind of provisional template for a museum of the future, and how might such a museum then open us up to another way of thinking about the various trajectories that inform our modern and contemporary here in India. So in each case, whether the Gray or the Godrej collection, it's not only the collection or the museum collection as an achieved set of objects. To me, it's also really about the interplay of possibilities that each space allows and invites us into. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ranjit. I think we've had quite a riveting evening because we started off with a pan-Indian trend of and a historic trend of how collecting has happened, and then we went abroad to see how some of our collections find homes there. and now a more immersive presentation that you gave about the relationship between art objects, artists, and their collectors. Since we don't have much time, there are already some questions that have emerged, and I'm just going to pose them to a few. We could start with Mortimer, you answering two questions that were first addressed to you. One was a very specific one where Shukla Sawant from JNU asks if the Air India art collection is also part of the winning bid for the airline that has gone to the Tata Sons. But also somebody is asking that apart from museums, what alternate modes of engagement exist with private collections, particularly in the South Asian context? And if you'd like to reflect on these two bits.
Yeah, firstly, in response to the Air India question, obviously this is all quite fresh. What I can say is that certainly there were 3 to 4 years ago, there were plans afoot in terms of cataloging the collection and also opening a gallery/museum of the collection. And I think those plans were put on hold whilst this issue of the privatization was getting sorted out. So my sense is that they were waiting for some resolution to the privatization of the airline because the collection would probably travel to the new owners. But I'm certainly not no expert, and that's purely my presumption. More generally, on the question of reaching out beyond the museum in terms of private collections, I was going to talk this evening about the idea of the catalogue as a means by which private collections can reach broader audiences. And in fact, this goes right back to the Indian Museum in the 1880s, and Chhatrapati talks about this in terms of producing the ideal viewer by making catalogues. And in recent times, I'm glad to say that there has been an increasing move by a lot of private collections to produce quality publications which are research oriented. And of course, that is very helpful then for scholars to access specific artworks. One of the major lacuna that we have in the Indian arts ecosystem is access to works, because in the absence of major collections on the part of public museums, where do you go to see the artworks? They're in private collections, right? And so unless you have the catalogue, and a catalogue, I'm not even talking about catalogue resumes, we haven't even got to that point yet. Mm-hmm. It becomes very hard to function, and that brings up questions of authenticity. Forgeries, of course, become rife if you don't have the catalogue in hand. The second thing is just the online space, and that's something I touched upon in my talk. And I clearly, private collections are now leveraging the online space in a way that simply wasn't possible 5 or 10 years ago. And I mentioned MAP, but you could also talk about the Ishara Foundation in Dubai, which is doing amazing work in engaging with audiences globally through talks, seminars, and there are a number of others. So.
Thank you, Mortimer. I think your mentioning about the catalogue also pushes us back to the idea of process of acquiring, and we have several questions around that from the audience, and I'm going to throw this back to both Jay and Ranjit, asking you, we all know about the convoluted process of works being acquired in public museums in India, but are there, are you aware of processes both within the private sector as well as abroad that are more friendly and that are more organic? We, of course, saw bits of that with what Jay was talking about in terms of curators getting informed through various conversations. But do you think things need to change about how acquisitions happen in museums in India? And if there are examples from elsewhere that you'd like to quote? And connected to that, do we feel that the collector is represented well enough when collections move to public spaces like museums? Would you like to go first, Jay? And then maybe Ranjit.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So we have a fairly convoluted acquisition process, as you might expect. We have a committee that's associated with each of the curatorial departments, and the curatorial departments are organized by medium. So the committee is made up of trustees of the museum and collectors, and they need to approve each acquisition before it enters the collection. They also contribute dues and make additional donations for the acquisition of works of art. We don't have extensive endowment funds for acquisitions. Of course, the curators present the works, and they've been in discussions with various people on these committees. So it's works are generally accepted if the curator stands behind them. But of course, the complication for us is in the current artistic world, there are many artists working in multiple media at the same time. So an installation may have to go through several committees before it can actually be accepted by the museum. It's sort of an historic process that I don't think is going to change, and it's connected with the way we fund acquisitions, which is, to a large extent through these committees. So the likelihood is we'll proceed that way. You could say we can end this artificial division by medium, but there's a very good reason for it, which is the storage needs of different media are extremely different. Photographs need entirely different environments from painting and sculpture. So as an administrative matter, the departments still make quite a bit of sense. So it is a complicated process, but it has so many things in its favor that I think it's going to continue for a while.
Right. Thank you. Ranjit, you want to say something about that?
Very briefly, because MJ has really provided a very eloquent explanation of the complexity of the scenario. I would just parse it in the following way. I think there's a fundamental let's say, lack of fit sometimes between a museum and its internal bureaucracy and the dominant narratives that drive the museum. We might be critical of this, but there are very, very good practical and other reasons why it's not just a pointless tyranny of some kind of taxonomical nature. There are very good reasons why museums work in the way they do. However, collectors are more nimble. They are not constrained by these things. So even in the two collections that I showed, for instance, one worked before a canon was ever formed, the other works in defiance of the canon. Now, how do you reconcile these two things? The museum bureaucracy, the big museum machine on the one hand, with its pre-existing taxonomy, and then all of the surprises and epiphanies and invitations to risk that a collection can bring in. So I don't know what the answer is, but one way of thinking about it is also to think of intermediate zones of exhibition and research, which you don't necessarily have to acquire this work. You might create forms of partnership where you bring things in from collections and show them in a museum space, thereby sharing them with the public. It's not necessary. Acquisition is not the only necessary answer to this.
Could I just mention one more thing, which is a trend that is just slowly developing? For years in our permanent installations, we only allowed things that were either in the collection or promised to the collection. But now in expanding the galleries and bringing in artists who weren't formally represented, we've come up against the problem of artists whose works can no longer be acquired. For example, Hilla af Klint, a Swedish artist, virtually all of her works remained in her own private foundation. We wanted to represent her in the section on early abstraction, but the only way to do that was to secure a long-term loan from her foundation. And I think that's also something that's going to happen more generally in the future. You won't have to acquire a work to show it in your permanent collection.
Right. And just stemming from this, there's another question which asking, what are your thoughts on artists' archives vis-a-vis artworks as compared to what collectors do? They collect from different artists. Is there a distinction? Of course, there's a distinction in the way these collections come together. And how do they really find place in museums or in public places? Is there a preference that museums have towards collectors rather than towards artists? Would you like to comment on that, any of you?
Well, I can talk about our archive.
Yes,
our archive it's not that old, actually. It was the someone in the director's office, I don't know, about maybe 40 years ago, who realized there were all sorts of important documents that were in collections in the different departments, and she brought them together into an archive. And since then, we have been acquiring, in some cases, individual artists from archives, from writers, from artists, but they need to have some connection to the collection. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any sense of having them in our archive. The library, of course, goes back much farther. And one interesting aspect is in the years when the museum had, a very focused collection on Western Europe and North America, there were artists who knew that the librarian in the museum was rather more open, and they would simply send him works on paper, which he would, access as into the library collection. And now in some cases, there are works that are being transferred from the library into the curatorial departments, but we're lucky that they came in through that rather forward-looking librarian.
Fascinating.
Can I make a point just about? I think what we didn't do is we didn't talk about first principles of how we define collectors or private collectors, as it were, in the history of that. In classic collection studies theory, there are sort of three distinctions one can make. One is collectors who look at the accumulation of art within what's called a fetishistic fashion, where they sort of overlay their own kinds of readings on their artworks. The second is souvenir collecting, where one goes to a location and buys work that reminds you of that space, that moment in time. And then the third is this notion of systematic collecting, which is closest aligned then to what museums do. And I would say in the present context, really, museums mostly are engaging with collections that fall into that third category of systematic collecting. Now, of course, in the South Asian context, the delineation between these different types of collecting modes is as yet hasn't really been discussed at any length or in any depth. So we're still sort of feeling our way out often in terms of understanding what these collections actually are in the kind of ontological sense within the Indian context.
No, thank you for bringing that up, Mortimer. I think when Ranjit made his presentation about Cymroza Ji's collection, which he's now curated and showing, the playfulness of how different types of objects come together through the personal taste of a collector, or even, as they sort of grow as human beings and start appreciating things from around the world, that playfulness sometimes kind of just gets lost when these things enter into large collections in museums, and they become very siloed, and there's of course value in understanding how that can be broken, if that play can kind of be maintained in museum collections. We have only 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to take two last questions. One from Priya Jaradi. She's asking, she's telling Ranjit that thank you for the excellent presentation. What are your thoughts on the paradox of private collections operating along transcultural routes and simultaneously being cast in canonical spaces defined by national cartographies?
Yeah. Priya, thank you very much for the question. I think actually collections of this nature would challenge us to think outside of conventional national histories. And I think in the Gray context, for instance, the form of collection, the process of collection is clearly tied up to transcultural circulations, to other kinds of strategic arrangements. All of these reflect. And yet there's a tendency to want to see these objects now as part of a nationalist history. And I think the invitation and the challenge here is to really dismantle these forms of nationalist history. I've often thought that also in terms of how we think about the art of the various South Asian countries. It's as if we just take the partition as a foundational event, which it was in some ways, but it's as if we've lost, whether in the visual arts or in architecture or in music, or in a number of other fields, theater, we've forgotten the things that bound us before the partition. And this is, I think it's very, very important to retrieve the histories from the 20s and the 30s. So whether it's the transcultural collection that's then put into a box, or the very way in which we think about a national history, I think we should allow sometimes collections and the evidence to really expand our way of thinking about these things. Also, just a very quick footnote, Joyoti, I think that in the case of Firoza's collection, not only is it what you correctly characterized as a certain playfulness of affect and response, but also it's a series of relationships between the collector and the collector as gallerist and philanthropist with associations. I'm particularly thinking of the subaltern artists in the collection. All of those ventures outside of the sanctioned metropolitan modernism, they have to do with an ethical commitment. So that's not playfulness alone. It's also an ethical commitment to represent parts of the art-making universe that otherwise get left below the radar.
That's right, and one doesn't see that in particularly in public museums. I mean, they're still just collecting the canons, and they're not really going beyond that. I think we could sort of end with a more kind of just a taste question, which I'll ask all three of you. If you could point us to some of the younger collections in India and at your end, Jay, that we should look out for in the future, and why so? Are there younger collections today in India that will kind of shine in the future that you think we should be looking out for? Or newer collectors and their collections that we should look out for?
Sorry, who's going first? Should I?
Yes, please.
So, I mean, I'm going to just dovetail this into, there was one other question about collections. Not all collectors are public with their collections, is what I saw Keshav just put into, and of course, we're talking today very much about collections which have a public aspect, and there are many very interesting younger collectors who are very engaged with what's going on and who are not public at all, and that's absolutely fine as well. I think the purpose of today's conversation also is very much talking about a very specific set of collectors who, for very specific reasons, have decided to engage publicly
in the public space.
So I'll just name one, which is the Anurag and Pyle. Gosh, have I forgotten his Khanna, Anurag and Pyle Khanna's collection, which is based in Gujarat and focuses in particular on new media works, and has already staked a claim in, I think, the ecosystem for its singular attention to that medium. And we have, as of yet, have had very few medium-specific collections coming to the fore. So I think that's
Thank you for that. Jay, Ranjit, you have any favorites?
I'm not in a good position to comment here. In my position, I tend to meet the established collectors. It's the curators, my curatorial colleagues, who are more in touch with the younger collectors. So I can't be terribly enlightening here, I'm afraid.
I understand. Okay.
Now, I was thinking about Anurag and Pyle Khanna too, actually, but for reasons somewhat different from Mort's reasons. Whilst, of course, they have this marvelous collection of new media art, the conversations that I've had with Anurag have actually had to do with his interest in a certain moment in Indian abstraction. And it is the kind of collection that one would point to for in terms of future direction, because it is transcultural. The collection has both South Asian and international artists. So I would like to think of future Indian collectors also as having that kind of range, which also connects a little bit to what Priya's question was about. If once collections become transcultural in their range and interests, then we'll hopefully begin to get past this nationalist way of thinking about art scenes.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for being on the panel today. We've run out of time. There are still a few comments and questions, which I'm sure somebody from the Asia Society can pass on to you as thoughts that have come out of this conversation. But let me thank all the speakers, and let me thank Asia Society and Cymroza Godrej for doing what she does for the world of the arts. And all the museums and other organizations who've come together as outreach partners for this lovely evening. And I'm sure there have been some very, very progressive and contemporary thoughts that have come out of this discussion, which will inform the community in how they look at private collections in public spaces. Thank you very much and good night.